Welcome to Knowing I Am. I'm Ken Ward, and with me is Matt Milling.
Hello.
And if you came to this podcast through the internet, I want to encourage you to go to our website, knowingiam.org, and click on the Start Here podcast located on the homepage so you can know what this is all about. If you're a listener working through the core lessons, then welcome back and let's get started. This is lesson number 4, the problem. This is the 4th lesson of the core lessons series. In lesson number 3, we examined some unique characteristics of the Bible, setting it apart from all other manuscripts. Having read the Bible, the goal of this lesson is to explain the dilemma mankind faces in this world.
Well, Ken, before we get started, just want to take a minute to talk to the listeners to let them know that if you remember back in the first lesson, we were just asking that people, you just believe what you're told. Well, we don't want people just to believe what we're telling them. I want them to put forth the effort. So when we come across a Bible verse, and we're actually going to read the verse on while we do the lesson, but it's the responsibility of the listener. Go to the Bible. Be sure to look at before and after the verse. Make sure you get the context correct. Because a lot of people support their arguments with one-line verses. That's not what we're trying to do. These Bible verses are going to be in these lessons to get you in the right place. And we will talk about those, but because they are a cut-to-the-chase verse to drive home the point.
The first thing we want to look at is this question, wasn't everything created good? Matt, what you got to say about that?
Well, I think we need to read the Bible verses. In the first couple of chapters of Genesis, it talks about the creation. And so we're going to go ahead and read the first one, which is Genesis 1:26 through 27. And it simply says, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." So the first thing we notice there is that we're made in the image of God. That is body, soul, and spirit. Now a little later at the end of the lesson, we're going to talk about that, but that doesn't address whether we're good or not.
I think it's interesting that it says, and God said, "Let us make man in our image." It makes you see that there's more to God. Yeah, who's he talking to? Who's there with him? Who's he going to make? It wasn't angels, because we're not made in the image of angels, and angels are not made in the image of God.
And if he says in our image, then the image has to be the same if we're made in the image of God.
Right. Who he's talking to has to be the same image as him.
So there's not a lot to say there except we're made in the image of God, and that's and I do want to say this, especially listening to Ravi Zacharias. One of the things he says that is everybody has value. Everybody's made in the image of God, and so when we look at other people, the way we treat them, we need to respect them. You can't control where you're born. You can't control what color skin you have. You can't control if you're male or female. Those are sacred things about a person. They can't change.
Right.
And so I don't believe in races. Of course, that's in Genesis 10, they're all one race, a human race, but I think the key, or what's really important about being made in the image of God, is I respect you because you're made in the image of God, and that's what I should do, no matter what I think about people, no matter how mean they are.
Right. Our next verse then is Genesis 1:31. "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day."
The point there is when he got done creating everything, he looked back at his work and he said, it's not just good, it's very good. Good as it gets.
Right.
And so the reason why we talk about was everything made good, well, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
When God had created everything had its order, everything had its place, everything knew what to do, everything was going to operate within the way God created it. As long as everything operates in the way that he intended it to operate, then there's no problem.
And if you look at nature as a whole, the whole earth, the whole environment, plants, animals, everything, take man out and everything else works right. We're the only ones that mess anything up. but why? So the next thing is, what happened?
To look at what happened, again, the first 2 chapters talk about the creation, and just so you don't really get confused, chapter 1 does really kind of go through the order, or does go through the exact order that things were created. The thing I wanted to point out about that is for example, he didn't bring man in until everything else was already created, so that there would be food and light and everything like that.
Right.
He didn't bring plants in until there was soil, until there was light, because plants have to have light. If you look back at the order that God created everything, it had to be in that order for everything to build up to the crescendo, if you will, of the introduction of man. So when you get to Genesis 3, it starts to get into what happened. Genesis 3, verses 3 through 5 is, I'm going to go ahead and start back at verse 1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, You shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the days ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. First thing I want to point out is God didn't tell Eve she couldn't touch it. And so what starts to happen is Eve doesn't know the Word of God. If you go back and look, God created Adam, and he named animals and did all this stuff. And that's when God told him not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then he created Eve. And so really the reason why we'll find out in a minute that this whole problem's pinned on Adam is because he didn't take the leadership role of passing on the truth of that he learned to his wife. As you can see here, she's a little confused about what God said. But then obviously Satan's lying to her, trying to tempt her. Mm-hmm. And so he says, surely if you eat that, you won't die. Now, we understand dying in our age. If relatives die, they bury them, put them in the ground. But what the word die means is separate. It doesn't mean necessarily physical death. It just means die. And a lot of people say, well, Adam and Eve didn't die. And they didn't when they ate from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. But what they did is they actually got separated from God. And we'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. So there is death involved. That just means separation from something. I like to point out in verse 5, and this is the problem with the world. Satan says that your eyes will be open and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And that word gods there, little g, it means judge. Right. So another way to explain this is that you will decide to judge what's good and evil. So instead of looking to God, who made everything perfect and he knows how everything runs, then you take on that responsibility and say, now wait a minute, I'm going to decide what's right and wrong. And that's what we see in the world today. We get into trouble because there's people out there trying to tell us what's right and wrong when they ain't got a clue. The only way you know what's right and wrong is to have a close relationship with God and he tells you.
You have to talk to the creator of right and wrong.
Right, or the creator, period.
The creator of everything.
Well, look at it this way, since we're talking about it. If I had a wind-up clock, which they don't make anymore, but I've got one, and I hope it don't ever quit. But if it breaks, if I could take it to the guy that made it, he's going to know how to fix it. If I take it to some guy that's never seen a wind-up clock, it's probably going to be in 1,000 pieces. This is what happened, and we see here is that Eve didn't get instruction from Adam, and basically she decided to step out on her own, but she made a decision to do her own thing.
Yeah.
And that at that moment, it's rebellion is what it's called, rebelled against God. So the next verse,
Isaiah 64, 6 through 7, and it says, But we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags, and we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind have taken us away. And there is none that calleth upon thy name, that stirreth up himself to take hold of thee. For thou hast hid thy face from us, and hast consumed us because of our iniquity.
And so what Isaiah is saying right there is, it's ruined us. No matter what good we do, it's not good enough. We don't know how to do good.
Right. I mean, if you think when people do anything that's good, maybe to benefit others, there's always some personal gain in there. We may not even realize it, but there's some ego behind that.
So what's the problem? Yeah, we understand that Eve got deceived and then rebelled against God, and that's where we made that decision. Our righteousness is not that good, but so what's the problem? So if we go to Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13, it says, and it's talking to God, about God, Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue, when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he? And so just wanted to point out in that verse, God is pure. He's not the one that fell. He created everything. He did it He's good. He cannot even look upon evil.
Yeah, Psalms 5, verse 4, for thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with thee.
So that simply is saying that God doesn't have pleasure, evil or bad things or wickedness, which is basically the same thing, but he can't even dwell with it. And so the problem is when we're separated from God, we can't dwell with God again because we're contaminated. That's a perfect word. Paul talks about it and calls it corruption. So because we're contaminated, we can never again be in the presence of God, no matter what right things we do.
Yeah, and I've heard people say, I hope I'm doing enough to get into heaven. Well, there's only one thing you can't do.
Well, it's like I was telling you earlier that I was talking to a woman and she said, I hope all my good stuff outweighs my bad.
Right.
And I didn't think about it at the time, and now if someone says that, I know what to say. I could say, well, let me go ahead and save you some trouble. It's not going to outweigh the bad, because no matter how much good you do, you're still going to have to pay for the bad, because good does not equal out bad.
Right.
It's not a scale. Hebrews 9:22, and it says, in almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. And that's just one of the verses where it talks about for remission of sins, there has to be shedding of blood. Ken, go ahead and read your verse.
Yeah, Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh the atonement for the soul.
I like to tell people these things. We got laws of physics, we got laws of nature, and I like to call these spiritual laws that God has in place. And so I don't know why there has to be the shedding of blood for the remission of sin. I don't know why that is. I can't fully comprehend that. God tries to tell us there the life is in the blood. So if you got to pay for your sin with the shedding of blood, then you have to give up your life to compensate for offending God, if you will, or doing something wrong. When it says
in other places in the Bible, it says the wages of sin is death.
Right, and I didn't put that in there, but that's exactly right.
It's the same thing. The blood has to be shed to pay back for the evil.
Right, and then part of this is because God is a perfect judge. Anything that's done wrong is going to be made right. So it's either going to be made right in this world, or it's going to be made right in the world to come. I mean, how would you like it, Ken, if you went through your whole life, people kept doing all this terrible stuff to you, and you knew that they were never going to have to answer for it? There would be no justice.
It kind of makes you not want to follow the rules yourself, doesn't it?
Right. Well, that's true, but then you're not going to have any hope.
Right.
And so God is a perfect judge. He's the one that created everything. He knows how everything's supposed to be. Remember, we talked about what would our God have to be? All-knowing, all-powerful, righteous. So what the problem is that we're separated from God, can't dwell with God. We have to pay for our sin somehow. Now, I got a little asterisk by the word sin. That's one of them churchy words, and it's really not understood anymore. Sin basically just means to miss the mark. And what that means is when God created everything, it was intended to be like this. And you sin if you don't exactly do it that way. You're not exactly doing it the way it's intended.
Right.
And so one of the things we said, if you back up to the other one, it says all kinds have lost their way. I'm reading the book of Jubilee, which isn't canonical. We'll talk about that later, but there was a phrase in there that I really liked, and this is for the flood. One reason God brought the flood is said all kinds have lost their way. What is the way? Well, the way is the way God intended. They've lost that. So when someone says, are you lost? What they're talking about is you've lost your way.
Right.
And as we've read in Isaiah, we've all lost our way. So we see what the problem is we're separated from God. We're not in any position to be able to right the wrong that we've done.
You said in Genesis that actually it was Adam that messed up, right?
Well, Eve originally, but Adam's blamed for it.
Adam's blamed for it because he didn't tell her correctly.
That's correct. He didn't pass it on.
And so anyway, why does that affect us? That was Adam. Why does that have to affect us?
We're going to look at a bunch of verses here. We're going to go ahead and read them all the way through first. First one is Romans 5:12 and then verse 14. 12 says, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Skip 13. 14 says, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. If you'll go ahead and read 1 Corinthians 15:21 through 22.
Okay. For since by man came death, by man also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive.
So I'm going to go ahead and read Romans 3:9 through 12. What then? Are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin. As it was written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth, there is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way, they are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. These verses that we read makes it real clear. The sin nature is what it's called. Missing the mark is passed on by the father. You're born, you have a father, right?
Right.
You have a mother.
Right.
The sin nature is passed down to you from the father. Again, that's one of those spiritual laws I don't think we fully comprehend or understand why. But those verses we read make it real clear. There's no one righteous, no, not one. All of us are gone out of the way. Remember I was talking earlier about we've lost our way. We're out of the way.
Yeah. You and I had talked about earlier. People will say, well, I was born this way. I'm an alcoholic because I was born this way, or, whatever. Well, just because you were born that way doesn't mean it was a good thing, because we're all born in sin nature. And I think that's a problem in the world today, is because those who want to make truth a relative thing also want to make this assumption that people are all born good, and if you just let them do what they're born to do, then everything will be good. And that is so wrong.
Well, yeah, just to repeat what you said, because you're exactly right. I've thought about that many times. I mean, we're all born the way we are, and we're born with the sin nature. So if we don't intervene, we're left our own devices. There ain't no telling what we're going to do. I mean, would you tell a person that likes to murder somebody, go, hey, quit murdering people? He goes, I'm born this way. Oh, well, Just go ahead. Don't come to my house,
Right.
So obviously that's not right. And another thing I wanted to point out, one of those verses we read, that none of us in our human nature, the way we're born, seeks after God. We don't want to understand unless something happens. If we just were born and nothing intervened, we wouldn't care about God. We wouldn't look for him. We're contaminated. We've gone out of the way. We got to pay for all the wrong things, even though we may not have done anything wrong. As soon as we have an opportunity, we do something wrong.
Absolutely.
So now we see that it's passed on to us, but are we really that bad? I mean, Ken, you and I know each other, and I would say the easy answer to that is, yeah, we are that bad, because I know a lot of things you've done. You know a lot of things I've done. We're not going to tell the listener right now, but
but I'm sure the listener thinks about it. I mean, come on. We all have. If you have absolutely nothing that you regret, nothing that you're ashamed of, nothing that you feel like, man, I wish I hadn't have done that. Come on, you're lying. Everybody feels that way.
Let me ask the listener this: is there anything you wouldn't tell anybody?
Yeah.
That you don't want to tell anybody that you did? But we're going to look at a Bible verse that called in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus said in Matthew 5:27 through 28.
You've heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart.
So it's not actually committing the act of something wrong. It's what we have in our heart, what we think about.
Right. So once you think about it, you've already committed it. You're already guilty of it.
You got to pay. You got to pay for it somehow with your blood.
And some people look at the Sermon on the Mount as, I can't even let myself think about a woman. Which, okay, that's great if you can do that. But what Jesus is really saying is you can't.
Right.
Forget about doing the act. You're already screwed because you thought about it.
Just to make it really clear, there's nothing you can do about this condition. And I did want to say this. People say, why God do this? Why God make this happen to us? Did he know that it was going to happen? Well, God knows all things. The answer is yes. I mean, we know that. Why did evil happen? Is God the creator of evil? When you read the Bible, it tells you that Satan had pride and he wanted to be above God. So that's where the rebellion was originally born. But the capability to do wrong is because love has to exist, and for true love to exist means there has to be a choice. That's what we call free will.
And people do ask that, well, why did God create us this way? Why didn't God, why does God let this evil happen? I mean, we could have been created as robots. We could have been created as animals. But God gave us this free will, this ability to think and reason that some philosophers think is the greatest thing in the world.
One thing he said is a good point. He could have made us like animals, but he didn't make us like animals. He made us in the image of himself.
Right.
So as you can see, God created everything good. What happened is Satan tricked Eve into rebelling. She did it willingly.
Yes.
The problem is now we're separated from God, and that there has to be bloodshed to make it right. Even though we may not have done the original sin, it's passed down to us through the generations. And we're not just a little bad, we're really bad. We're eat up. So that's where we're at. So before we wrap this up, I wanted to say a little word about being made in the image of God. If you look on the notes at the bottom, if we're made in the image of God, you got the body, soul, and spirit. The white boxes mean they're uncontaminated or righteousness. That's the way we were created, or the way Adam was created originally. And then the dark boxes mean it's corrupted by sin. So at the fall, the body became corrupt. That's why we die and go 6 feet under now. The soul is corrupt, which means we're separated from God. The spirit is corrupt. We don't have the spirit of God. We got the spirit of man. Mm-hmm. And then when a person gets saved, they get the spirit of God, and then the Holy Spirit seals our soul till the day of redemption. Those two are redeemed, but then the body's still corrupt. That's where you and I are today.
Right.
And so until we die and shed this body, and obviously we'll have to have a lesson about this in the resurrection, when we get a new resurrected body that is incorruptible, then we'll be back in the image of God the way we were originally created in the garden like Adam.
Right.
If you think about these things and really be honest with yourself, and as I've thought about them in my life, we see we really got a dilemma. So in the next lesson, we're going to see if God has an answer.